Welcome to everyone this morning for our fifth panel on the virus and the vaccine. We've been going at this not quite as long as the virus has been with us, but I trust and hope that it's been informative and helpful to all those, and especially all the repeat people in the audience. Thank you so much. For those of you who are new, we have our repeating panel coming back. They are truly an all-star team, and I am so very grateful for all their effort and their willingness to participate. So short introductions, for them. Leading off this morning will be Steve Cucchiaro. Steve is President and Chief Investment Officer of 3Edge Asset Management based in Boston. He was previously President and CIO of Windward Asset Management, Investment Management. It was a $20 billion asset management fund. More particularly, he is on the board of the IHME, which is the Institute of Health Metrics and Evaluation, which is affiliated with the University of Washington. And they've been sort of a go-to resource for many governments and institutions as far as their modeling of the virus and how it has behaved across various metrics. So he's going to give us an update on that. Then we'll be moving to Glenn Grossman. Glenn was formerly the Senior Director of Outcomes Research at Novartis. He's an epidemiologist with over 20 years of experience, and he's been involved with various projects associated with Medicare, Medicaid, Veterans Administration, CDC, and pharmaceutical companies. He has now hung out his shingle as a consultant. So if you need that type of help, Glenn's there. And then finally wrapping it up for us is Vishal Gulati. And Vishal is a venture partner at Draper Esprit. And he's been investing in health tech and genomics and synthetic biology for a while. He's a former Rhodes Scholar and former clinical virologist or researcher at Imperial College. And we are very privileged to have three great points of view to bring to you this morning. So with that, I'll go ahead and hand it over to Steve, who will focus on the IHME models and give us an update as well on some public market aspects of what's been going on.
Well, thank you, Bill. It's been a pleasure to be part of this over several periods. And what I'd like to do is share my screen and share a slide presentation. And
already.
Let me know if that works.
Yep.
Great. So what I'd like to talk about today is I'd like to present to everybody our latest projections from the IHME on the coronavirus. And we'll be looking at a base case, a worst case, and a best case scenario. And then I'd like to describe how that has some important implications into the global capital markets, into investing, into investment strategy, and how the COVID crisis has had, I think, a pivotal impact on the future direction of the markets. So first, this first chart shows daily US deaths of COVID. So we're just looking at the US right now. And as we predicted last year, we were in a bad seasonality period between September of last year and January. And because we model the coronavirus in 186 different countries in two different hemispheres, we're able to get very statistically significant confidence around our idea that the coronavirus is very seasonal. And of course, there are other factors that impact it, but all other factors equal, the seasonality is very important. And so while many were predicting the coronavirus not having another peak last winter, we were in the camp that was contrarian, and we predicted a peak. And then when things really got worse in January, we predicted that was the top of the peak, and then things would be declining, and they have. And what you see here are three cases going forward. And the general notion is that between now and early September, between the seasonality component being in the favorable phase And between the vaccinations having rolled out to a very great extent in the US and continue to roll out, our projected deaths are coming down rapidly. Only in the worst case scenario might they flatten out, but still not get worse than they are now. And in our base case and our best case scenario, they really come very low by the end of September. Now, I will point out that this forecast ends at the beginning of September. And in theory, there's another risk after September. We would be entering the adverse part of the seasonality phase going from September to January of 2022. And the whole goal is to get the infections down sufficiently so that there's not an attempt by that the virus will not have a great opportunity to infect enough people to get the R²/1 and to get things rolling again. So the whole key is to get that low before the next seasonality phase kicks in. Of course, there are two risks. One risk is that there's a sufficient group of people who refuse to be vaccinated, and that anyone who refuses to be vaccinated and ends up getting the virus is a candidate to create a mutated version. And then, of course, while some mutated versions are benign, there's always the possibility that a mutated version would come out that would not be vulnerable to the antibodies or the virus. And then number two, we have a terrible situation going on in other parts of the world like India. And there's always a risk that there's a contagion that would spread from there and infect other places. But aside from those two risks, we're looking at some good news between now and September. Now, if I move on to total deaths, something I wanted to say is that we took a position at the IHME based on a much more extensive data set that we have now than we had in the past to try to calculate the error rate in reporting COVID deaths. And the conclusion that we came to by looking at trends of what deaths would have been in the absence of COVID and comparing them with what they are in real life is that COVID deaths have been seriously underreported over the last several months. And so we are now saying that the total deaths due to COVID are substantially higher than they were. So that's why we're showing higher absolute numbers than we have in the past. But the trend is very similar. These are cumulative deaths. And of course, they flatten out very much so between now and September, except in the worst case, there's still a bit of more accumulation. So let me talk now about impact on investments. From time to time, the markets behave according to a certain set of rules. And there are certain investment strategies that thrive under that set of rules. And once in a great while, the rules change. You have a regime shift. And on the other side of a regime shift with different rules, the investment strategies that work really well before the regime shift no longer work well after, and new investment strategies work well. We think that there's a very good chance that COVID was the catalyst for a major regime shift in the investment markets, and that has important implications for investment strategy. Before COVID, all of the focus on stimulus was monetary stimulus. When we had a financial crisis in 2008, it was the Federal Reserve Board that came in and unleashed great monetary stimulus. Before COVID, we had asset price inflation. Stock market has been booming. Other markets have been booming. Before COVID, we had capital-friendly policies, tax cuts, deregulation, policies favoring Wall Street. Post-COVID, now coming to the government coming to try to rescue the economy, we've had tremendous fiscal stimulus. The nature of that is money getting more directly in the hands of the real economy and people, and not just in the markets. We are now seeing the early signs of a rise in consumer inflation, the likes of which we hadn't seen in many years. We are seeing more labor-friendly policies and trying to help unemployment come down. Policies favoring more Main Street. Going down this graph, up until COVID, we've had many years of falling interest rates. In post-COVID, now we see rising interest rates, which are also consistent with the fiscal stimulus. We saw a great desire for growth equities, and they outperformed greatly over the last several years because people were looking to invest in companies that could grow without the economy itself growing so fast. Well, now the economy is projected to pick up a lot, not just in inflationary terms, but in real terms. And so now we think value equities, which had greatly underperformed, will start to outperform. And then we've seen with falling interest rates, that's been very beneficial for bonds and fixed income. Now we see a scenario where in the regime shift, real assets are outperforming. A lot of debate about inflation. And this meeting is very timely because we just had an inflation report yesterday that shocked a lot of people. But something we've been saying all along is that inflationary cycles, and there are many that go back in time, have 5 phases. First, it starts off with a lot of monetary stimulus. Then you see it show up in gold prices, and that started a couple of years ago. Then you see it in rising commodity prices and producer prices. We saw that a few weeks ago. Then you see it in rising consumer price inflation. We just saw that yesterday. And then finally, you'll see it show up in core inflation, or that's consumer price inflation excluding food and energy. We call that the caboose in the train of inflation. That 5th stage is what the Federal Reserve Board is watching. So they're often behind the curve because they're watching the tail end of the inflation cycle before they move. Beyond that, the Federal Reserve Board, unlike the past, has made a departure and said, we're not even going to try to preempt inflation. In fact, we're not even going to raise rates when we see it. We're going to wait till we see it for a sustained period before we do anything. So they're going to be slow to the game, and that could help inflation persist more. I had an opportunity to speak. I'm on the advisory board at MIT Sloan School, and I had an opportunity to speak with Ben Bernanke. And he is convinced that the inflation will be transitory. It's nothing to worry about. But I also know that sometimes inflation, it's not just a mathematical exercise. Inflation can be driven by psychology. And if enough people believe inflation is going to accelerate, that can be self-fulfilling. So we are concerned about inflation. This is a chart that shows how much growth equities have outperformed value over time. This is showing the value equity index divided by growth index. So when the chart is high, it's good for value. When the chart is low, it's good for growth, bad for value. From 2000, when the tech stock bubble burst, to 2007, we had a tremendous rise in value securities outperforming growth. Ever since the financial crisis has been the other way around until just recently, we think as part of this regime shift, we will now see continued outperformance of value over growth. The pendulum swings from time to time over the years, favoring either international equities or US equities. And this chart shows the impact of that pendulum swinging. Back in the 1970s, we had international equities outperform the US, and then it swung back to US, swung back to international, back and forth 9 times. Lately, we've had a long duration of outperformance of the US, and sometimes investors get complacent and just assume it's going to be like that forever. But you can look at history and know that the pendulums will swing back and forth because the US stock market and the US stock market index, in particular the S&P 500 index, has a lot of growth equities embedded within it. We believe that's why it outperformed over the last several years. With the regime shift, we now think it can favor value equities, and a lot of the international equity indices have more value equities within them. Gold. Gold goes through bull markets and bear markets, and there are many factors that impact gold, but one of the strongest is the direction of real interest rates. And by real interest rates, I mean inflation adjusted rates. When interest rates, the 10-year Treasury bond yield rises faster than expected inflation, that's bad for gold. When inflation rises faster than interest rates, that's good for gold. And you can see the blue line shows real interest rates since the year 2001. The gold line shows the price of gold. And you can see it's almost a perfect mirror image. And over the last 2 years, gold has gone way up because real rates have come down. In the first 3 months of this year, real rates ticked up and gold ticked down. We believe there's a good chance now that inflationary expectations can continue to pick up, maybe faster than Treasury bond yields. and this could be good for gold. Commodities. Almost every market in the world has been in a bull market since the financial crisis of 2008, except commodities. Commodities have been in an extreme bear market, and commodities have never been underperforming to the extent that they have been compared to equities as they are now. And yet you go back to the 1970s and you see you have these major spikes or these major commodity cycles where from time to time commodities greatly outperforms equities and then falls down. And we think that now commodities, ever since the summer, is starting to pick up and outperform equities. We think we're in the early stages of what could be a long-term outperformance of commodities. And then to wrap up, I just wanted to talk about some of the risks we see. One is the Fed and many are saying, don't worry about inflation, it's transitory, it'll come right back down. Well, no one can guarantee that. And if it doesn't, the markets aren't priced for that. There's so much debt in the corporate bond market and it's priced for perfection. And if interest rates rise, if credit spreads rise, if we get into a surprising recession, we could have a corporate debt bubble burst, just like the housing bubble burst in 2007. Tax policy changes are on the minds of many investors. We could get profit taking, and because there's more leverage than ever in the markets, profit taking could force deleveraging and could get ugly, kind of what happened yesterday, but on a bigger scale. And then there's plenty of geopolitical instability. So with that, I want to turn it back to Bill, and I thank you for your time.
Great. Yeah, Steve, thanks so much. You know, I think your point on the regime change is so well taken. Potentially, we stand at a generational, I believe, a generational transition for the markets, and the virus is really kind of part and parcel, you know, to that. So, you know, for a closer look in terms of what's going on, you know, with the virus, the vaccine situation, I want to hand it over to our expert there, Glenn Grossman. So Glenn, go ahead and take it away.
Thanks, Bill. Great job, Steve. A lot of really great information there. All right, let me share this. And let's see if I can make this full screen. All right, so I'm going to just drive through at a high level some of the specifics globally, because we have to keep on coming back to this idea that it is a global pandemic. And so things that are occurring around the world are going to hit the United States very rapidly after. So right now, the COVID pandemic is raging in many countries around the world. You can see geographically what, I mean, we've talked about India and Brazil and a bunch of these other countries. You see even Sweden that came up early last year in terms of their approach. Their rate is quite high. When you look at whether it's getting better or worse in a lot of countries, here we're looking at the reproduction rate. This was calculated by Our World in Data, and you can see that anything in blue, it's getting better, it's in the good direction. Anything not in blue is getting worse. So whether it's getting worse slowly or getting worse rapidly, you can see based on the coloring. The next chart here is the test positive rate. The ones that are orange or red are high test positive rates, which means that there's a lot of people who are infected who are probably just not getting tested. And so that means that if we really don't know what's going on in those countries very well. We just know it's bad, and we don't really know exactly how bad it is, just that it's worse than we can tell. Here we're looking at the death rate. And interestingly, this is surprising to me and to other people when you look at it a little bit more closely. So for instance, when you look at South America, Brazil, which has been raging for quite some time, still has a pretty high mortality rate. Based on what we would have assumed was the herd immunity threshold maybe 6 months ago, we see that the mortality rate is still quite high, which means that people are getting reinfected and people are still dying at a very high rate relative to those that are getting infected. And so this and particularly the other thing is the seasonality that Steve mentioned. We do see a strong seasonality effect in many areas, yet South America is sort of defying that based on the variants that are spreading there, and that's quite worrisome. Anyway, let me go to the next. So here we're looking at the vaccines. You see that there is, we are doing a poor job of delivering widespread vaccination. And what this means is that when we talk about the development of variants and other things, this is going to come back and we'll be dealing with this for a while. Whoops. All right. Next, can you hear me okay? Oh yeah, I see. All right, so the next part is the, so this is one vaccine dose. You can see that, a bunch of countries are doing particularly well, but not a lot. There's a lot of countries that are not doing very well. When it comes to 2 doses, it's even less. So certainly in the United States and some other countries, we prioritized getting most people vaccinated with 2 doses instead of 1 dose, whereas in much of Europe, the priority and other countries, the priority was to do as many people as possible with 1 dose first, and then sort of delay the time until the 2nd dose was given, just as a way of getting as many people initially vaccinated with some level of protection, which is, to be honest, a fairly high level of protection just from that 1 dose alone. But the 2nd dose definitely provides a lot more protection even on top of it. The incremental value is still there. All right, here's where we are in the United States. I've overlaid these two graphs. One is the cases, and that's in the red, and then the yellow is the death rate. You can see that there's a delay in the deaths. We should be seeing a divergence soon in terms of cases versus deaths, where based on the vaccination rate, we expect that the death rate will and the hospitalization rate will go down as a proportion of the cases that we identify. We see that there is variation within the United States in terms of states that are getting hit. And so this is interesting. Across most, every state, there might be 1 or 2 exceptions at this point. We are seeing a decrease now, largely driven to Steve's point by the seasonality of this and the vaccination rates that we're looking at. All right, talking about vaccination rates, you see that there is variation around the country in the United States. So at a national level, the national average is that among adults over the age of 18, we're at around 59%, almost 60% have had at least 1 dose, which is great. But you see that there's wide variation by states. So for instance, the Northeast, California have a higher level of people vaccinated with at least 1 dose, whereas in the South, there's not as much, it's a lower level. Interestingly, and this is, we were talking about this a little bit earlier before we really got into the call. Last summer, we had that surge in the South, and the South had done pretty well prior to that. And one of the hypotheses was that the South is sort of opposite to the Northeast, where in the winter, it tends to be mild and people tend to spend more time outdoors, and so the risk tends to be lower. Whereas in the summer, it tends to get hot and humid. And so that's when people spend more time indoors, and the exposure actually might increase. Interestingly, the flu and cold seasonality in the South and the Northeast is roughly the same. It corresponds in the fall, winter, spring months. So the fact that we saw that surge in the summer last year in the South was a little bit weird. And so I think this is a hypothesis. A lot of us are looking to see, will we see something similar now, particularly because the vaccination rate that you see here is poorer in much of the South. And so I think that's an open question, particularly because of what we're seeing in South America, what I just showed you a little earlier, that in what should have been their summer there was still widespread COVID occurring. All right, here we're looking at US vaccination rates. You can see, I guess we've talked about it you've heard it in the news, that the vaccination rates are starting to plateau a little bit. They're going to pick up just because now people, kids age 12 and over can now get vaccinated. But when we're looking at the adults, where we really need to get the higher risk folks vaccinated at a higher rate, we are seeing this plateau that's a little bit too early, unfortunately. You can see where other countries have plateaued. So Israel plateaued at around 60%, a little bit higher. United Kingdom they're still increasing, but they started to decrease at a certain point. United States, we're sort of plateauing at a lower rate, unfortunately. Other countries, India is very slowly vaccinating. So you can see how globally we're doing. Let me just jump through. One thing I want to stress here is that vaccines are extremely effective, but don't eliminate the risk. What we have here is an example in the Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report put out by the CDC. This was in a nursing home where one person infected and caused an outbreak in the nursing home. The vast majority of people in the nursing home, both the residents and the staff, were vaccinated. And yet, even among the vaccinated people, there were a bunch of people who had symptoms, and one person actually died. And so it's the vaccines are amazing, but they will not eliminate the risk, and people will still die. And so this is something that we will probably just continue to hear about over the next year. It's nothing to be amazingly worried about, but at the same time, the fact that it's existing, I think it's still an open question about transmission. I think the sum of evidence is now saying that the transmission risk is really quite low. But as variants emerge and as time goes on and people's immune systems get reduced a little bit in terms of their immune memory, this could become an open question as we hit next fall and winter. So because we're going to have to talk about the vaccination rate again come fall or winter if we have booster shots that we start having to talk about with the variants. This is, I'll just skip through this. That's just the vaccination rate globally. I'll talk about just a few more things here, and then we can go on to Vishal. So here's Israel, just as a snapshot. So Israel, in terms of the percentage of the population that's totally vaccinated versus one dose, the top one is totally vaccinated, and you see that it's roughly around 60%, or slightly above. It's approaching 60%. It's a little bit more who have had at least one dose of the vaccine. Typically, what we're saying is that by the time you get to around 50% of the people vaccinated, you should see an impact on mortality and hospitalization. When you get to around 60%, then you see a strong impact in terms of spread. And so that's what we're expecting to see here. UK, we're seeing something differently. Look at that UK rate; it's down really low. They've been they were under lockdown for a while, and so that contributes to things as well. Israel also for a while had these really severe constraints, so that's overlaid with the impact of the vaccine that we're looking at. All right, now I just wanted to jump into variants, then I'll just quickly touch on the overlay of the vaccines versus the variants, because that's a question that people are going to talk about, and then get into therapeutics, and then I'll call it a day. So basically, variants are the big issue that we need to be thinking about with this. Variant evolution is driven by three things: the total volume of spread. So when you look at the global spread here, when you have more cases, then it's whatever the mutation rate that it is for this virus, it's assumed to be pretty constant. And so then if the dice rate is constant, then the number of rolls of the dice is really what we have to look at. And in this graph, in the global view, the higher it is, the more dice rolls there are. And so that's really what's driving the variance here. It's not the mutation rate as much as it is which I crossed off. That's the third thing on the bottom. It's because that's a constant. The real thing that's driving the variance are the mutations, let's say, are the number of dice rolls, how many cases there are. But the selection pressure in terms of reinfection rates, if people have some immune resistance already, and vaccination rates, that provides the selection pressure that sort of matches with sort of how contagious the new variants are, that sort of determines which variants emerge as the new variants of concern and what can penetrate our vaccine shield. So what we really have to be looking at when we look at the variants that are emerging is really this global view here in terms of the number of cases. Probably the variants of concern that we're going to need to be concerned about in November, December of this year have not even emerged yet, because the dices are continuing to be rolled, or the dice rather, it's a plural, are continuing to be rolled. And so the cases right now are just continuing to churn out all these mutants. And so that means that this is a story that's still being told. When we look at the current vaccines, well, first I'll talk about this in a second, but when we look at the current vaccines and how well they do against the variants that are currently out there, they're tending to do pretty well. They do vary by the type of variant, and there is variation in that. But the variants of concern, like I say, are going to be emerging. And the selection pressure, as more and more people get infected, then that means that there's going to be stronger selection pressure to really encourage the mutations that enable the virus to reinfect people or to bypass that, because those are the ones that are going to be most likely to survive. So when the caseload is this high, this really puts us at risk, but it's particularly in the United States, but also globally for another surge this coming winter. All right, Biden. So we're doing a much better job of sequencing the genetics of the virus now than we were. So we have a really good idea what's going on in the United States. You can see B117, which was called the UK variant. is really overwhelming the other variants in the United States. But still, the P1s, which is Brazil, they're still competing somewhat. All right, so let me see if I can make this a little bit bigger. Otherwise, I'll just talk to it, though it's kind of small. So what I have here is a matrix. On the top, what we have are the variants of interest and the variants of concern. And then you can see against how effective they are against the different vaccines and what we're looking at. So generally, the B117 is not really impacted by the vaccines are extremely effective against them. There's no real difference. So we are happy about that. The vaccines are likely to prevent that as it exists right now. For the what was called the Brazil variant or the South Africa variant or the India variant, there is a decrease. However, the vaccines that we currently have are still highly effective against those variants as well. There's still a lot of uncertainty as the variants emerge. And so one of the key ways that we find out which variants are the ones that are concerning is we look at maps like this, essentially, where we see over time which variants are spreading the most. And so then we look at those, and that's sort of how things become variants of interest and variants of concern. Mutations on their own are not concerning. It's the growth rate of those mutations in the population as they compete against the other variants that sort of make it interesting and what we need to be worried about. All right, I'll just look at a few more things. We have some early evidence looking at the India variant because that's what a lot of people are interested in now because it's causing so much havoc, not just in India, but some other countries, and it has arrived in the United States already. It's not heavily spreading in the United States yet. So basically, we have some good news here so far, and so that is that basically the current people who have current antibodies from the mRNA vaccines, in particular, this study was looking at the Pfizer vaccine. Looks like that should also be pretty protective against the India variant as well, which is good news for us. It's sometimes called a double variant or a triple variant, but it looks like that does not increase the risk that we have in terms of getting through the vaccine. So our vaccines are still holding up pretty well. However, this is something that I saw that was a little bit concerning, and I'm going to be following this more. So in the UK, where the UK variant was doing so much havoc, the UK, so between the UK variant spreading so much and the amount of vaccines that are in the UK, UK has been doing extremely well. We just saw on the chart just a couple minutes ago that the UK caseload has dropped dramatically. Yet the fact that what we have here is one of these India variants, this B1617.2, that's spreading on an exponential rate within the UK currently, is disconcerting a little bit. And so I'd like to track that more. Maybe Vishal can speak if he's been tracking this. But so this is one of these things that makes me think we're not out of the woods yet. And so this is something we need to track. All right. I'm not going to talk about age too much. If there's questions, we can get into it. I just figured there'd be some questions about the new Pfizer emergency use authorization. Yes, it is very effective for kids age 12 to 15. It is very safe. Everyone in the United States should get their kids vaccinated at this age if they are eligible. The one thing, there is a debate among epidemiologists. Well, is this a waste of vaccine? Should we be vaccinating other people globally? Because it is a global pandemic, and there is something valid to be said for that. We really need to do a much better job of vaccinating globally. But within the United States, I think that having access to the vaccines for this age group is beneficial, and we should be vaccinating people where we can. All right, just a couple other things. Treatments. This is the sum of evidence where we are generally on the treatments. The sum of evidence is still expanding. You see that a lot of early hypotheses didn't really prove clinically beneficial. And so we've really narrowed it down. The corticosteroids have been very effective. There's a couple of others that we're looking at. A couple others that have recently come in the news. Ivermectin has shown some benefit. This was a sum of evidence that was done and looking over the last week or two that was just published. These are all very small studies that showed a strong effect at both preventing mortality and morbidity. But these results would need to be replicated with larger sample sizes in order to really drive new therapeutics in the market. But this is still, it's interesting that these results are so strong, so I'm definitely paying attention to this. Let me see if I should talk. One last thing, and then we can go on. I'll leave it with Vishal. So this is something, sometimes flu has been compared to COVID. And so this was an interesting study in the Veterans Health Administration that was just published recently. And this was looking at the death rates or persistent morbidity after people had recovered from COVID-19. And what they're finding is that there's actually a persistent inflammation and persistent effects that increase people's risk for heart attack, stroke, clots, other types of really severe outcomes after they've recovered from COVID. And when you compare people who have COVID and the risk, say 6 months or more after, versus people who have flu and are hospitalized, I would have expected that the risks would have been somewhat similar in terms of having maybe a persistent impact in terms of, we know that these are inflammatory events and that there'd be some persistent impact. But the fact that COVID is 50% more likely to result in mortality among these people who are hospitalized with COVID versus flu is disconcerting, and is something that means that the healthcare system is going to need to still be paying attention to this, and not just in the United States, but outside of the United States. All right, Vishal, I will leave it up to you after that. And I'm definitely open to questions. I have a lot of follow-up slides if people are interested.
Hey, Glenn.
Hey.
If all of these vaccines target slightly different things, right? If I've already
no, they all target the spike protein, I thought.
If I've already got one vaccine, why don't I get another one?
Yeah, so there's a couple of answers to that. So the spike protein there's slightly different version of the spike protein that were addressed by the different vaccines. And so they have different efficacy rates. Part of it might be the technology itself in terms of mRNA versus the adenovirus versus whatever. Some of it is that there's just different versions of the spike protein that they were looking at. That's an open question. It hasn't been explored clinically in terms of clinical trials. And so we don't have an empirical answer. Theoretically, if you've gotten an mRNA vaccine, they are so good already that you probably would not have much incremental benefit to getting another one. There's probably quite a bit of overlap between Moderna and Pfizer. What would be more of value is if we find new variants that emerge and we continue to do these updates in terms of the current vaccines out there, looking at booster shots in the fall, then it would probably be beneficial if a booster shot does become available to wait until the fall to become that. Particularly now, depending on what country you're in, we showed just a little earlier that there's wide variation in the amount of spread going on globally. And so that's really, especially as we go into the summer months, the vaccines really become so much less important because there's just less risk, there's less spread. But in countries where the spread is high, just getting vaccinated, it's more important to get other people around you vaccinated than yourself, even in terms of looking at the incremental value of the protection.
Well, I travel, so I'm in several different countries.
Yeah.
The state of play in Houston right now is there's more vaccines than there are takers. That is, I can literally walk into a drugstore and get a vaccine. Why wouldn't I get another one?
Yeah, it's the question of the incremental value. The incremental values, as my perception is that it would not be high currently. But as our immune memory fades over time, say by next fall, winter, then a booster might be something we'd be considering. We have to look at the empirical evidence. But for now, I don't see much incremental value of getting another vaccine, particularly when you look at these efficacy rates with the mRNA vaccines. Most likely, the chance of getting severe disease or hospitalization is quite low, particularly among people who don't have pre-existing conditions and that kind of thing. So I don't see, just in terms of the cost benefit ratio. So if you get a vaccine, a lot of people get side effects, and so that could be a reason not to get one if it knocks you off your feet for a day. Yeah. Vishal, I don't know
if I can add one thing to that, Chris. If that vaccine could be given to someone else, because most of the world is not yet vaccinated, and I think that it should be it is important not just for those people, but also for us, that the whole world should be vaccinated, rather than some people being vaccinated several times when the incremental benefit is relatively low.
I follow that, obviously, but the vaccine I'm talking about is in a pharmacy a half mile down the road. It's already there. I mean, there are more vaccines available in Houston than there are takers.
Well, that's how the market operates, right? If people were not taking it, then it would not be there. So so anyway, I think Glenn's point stands. I think the incremental benefit of having a vaccine, if you are fully vaccinated currently, is relatively low. And I think it would be better if you waited and took it later, because one thing we don't know about these vaccines is how long does this immune response last?
Yep.
And I think that jury is still out on that. And it is not clear whether this is going to last for 1 year or 2 years. And unfortunately, there's no way that we can find that out until that much time has elapsed. So I suspect that we will all be getting regular boosters against a mixture of coronaviruses, which would be different variants that will emerge. And hopefully we'll be able to track them, and we'll be able to quickly make vaccines which will then be given to us. And I think that over the years, we will all develop widespread immunity against the whole range of coronaviruses, which will include the viruses which have not yet been encountered by us. So I think that's how I see the world evolving. So thanks very much, Glenn and Steve, for your talks. I took a slightly minimalist approach this time. I did not make a long set of slides. I just have one slide which has topics that if I could share my slides. Am I allowed to share?
Yes.
Give me 1 second. So I was going to talk about 3 things essentially, and these 3 things. The reason I picked these 3 things are because these are the 3 things that I have seen being reported in the media over the last few days. And these are some hot discussions that have been ongoing. Can you see my screen?
Yes, you're good.
Okay. So one discussion that started about a week and a half ago was around patents. It was discussion came up about a year ago, and then it sort of died, and then it came back. And then recent panic that I'm seeing in the media is that why are vaccinated people getting infected? And the third one was, are these variants going to kill us? So I just thought I will pick these up and try and give you what the science behind all this is, and why I think you should worry about, and what other things you should not worry about. So let's start from the bottom. So Glenn did a really good analysis of variants, and variants will occur. It's the natural course of viruses. They have a certain rate of variation, and when you have millions and potentially billions of people getting infected with this virus, every time this virus replicates, there is a possibility that it mutates, and some of those mutations will be worse than others. So the couple of things that Glenn picked up on, one was around the data he showed around neutralizing antibodies. I find that, so all the data that I have seen, I do not believe that the data on neutralizing antibodies is highly predictive of how protective a particular vaccine is against a particular variant. And the reason why I say this is because we saw this even among people who have neutralizing antibodies against coronaviruses because of previous exposure to other coronaviruses. They don't seem to be very well protected. It seems that the protection against COVID is a mixture of neutralizing antibodies and cellular immunity. And what is happening is that we are measuring neutralizing antibodies more frequently than we are measuring cellular immunity, because having been a virologist, I can tell you how hard it is to measure cellular immunity. So it's just a harder experiment. So no one ever bothers to do it. So we are doing things which we can do rapidly and publish lots of papers, but I'm afraid it's not representative or predictive of how variants will affect us. The second thing to keep in mind about variants and vaccines is that almost all variants will have some resistance from the vaccine that we have. And the reason is that, so I do not believe that the response just falls off a cliff. So the response is graduated. And so new variants will be, because of immune pressure, they will drift slightly further away from where the immune response is. But I believe that they will not drift very far. And the reason for that is that the spike protein against which we build this immune response is necessary for the virus to bind to the receptor by which it infects us. So if the drift happens for a while and it drifts beyond a certain point, then chances are that that virus will not be very highly infective in itself. So we may get some protection from that virus anyway, even without the vaccine being able to neutralize it. So that was around the variants. The second one was around, there is this panic which happens every morning when on Twitter, when I wake up, when someone has read an article which says, oh my God, look at these fully vaccinated people and they have got infection. And the answer to that is they will get infected. There is no vaccine yet which prevents infection completely. In fact, I believe that most vaccines will have breakthrough deaths as well. And the reason I say that is because in most of the clinical trials, which covered 20,000 or 40,000 people, the approvals were based on 200 to 300 cases only. So what that tells you, that out of the 200 to 300 cases, in which case most of the cases were actually in the unvaccinated group, in the vaccinated group, there just weren't enough infections for us to see rare cases which were severe or which led to the patient dying. But the good news is that the number of deaths in that group, as we have seen from the data that Glenn showed, are going to be very, very infrequent, to the point that this will not appear to be a disease which we should be that concerned about. And it probably is going to be, those deaths will probably be concentrated in older age group and in people who have other chronic conditions alongside. So that's how it will happen. So if you read in the papers that someplace in Seychelles or someplace in, which is what I read recently, and someplace in India, or you get a message on your WhatsApp, as I'm getting from India, oh my God, I know 2 people who were fully vaccinated and they got infected. Of course they got infected. They will get infected. But in almost all cases, the infections will be self-limiting. And in most cases, they won't even be symptomatic. So that's the third thing that I wanted to briefly touch upon, was around patents. And I think that recently the discussion has moved on to whether, so the panic that we have about variants, which these variants are coming from parts of the world where there isn't enough vaccine and we haven't vaccinated enough people, and they are getting millions and millions of infections. And as those infections happen, you see variants like we have seen one from India. When we were having many infections and very high levels of transmission in the UK, we saw the Kent variant. So all these variants will emerge from places where there will be very high levels of transmission. And so there is this belief that if we somehow remove the hurdles of patents, we would have billions of doses of vaccines being manufactured. But I don't believe that that is true. The reason I don't believe that is true is because the true hurdle along the way of vaccine is not the patents. Of course, it would be nice to not have the hurdle of the patents, but taking that hurdle away is not going to lead us to be able to immunize more people. And the reason is that the manufacturing capacity around the world is very, very limited. And more limited than that is the know-how of how to transmit this how to build these vaccines. These are complex molecules. It's highly complicated manufacturing process, and it's not very easy to scale up. And so I believe that more than patents, we should be looking at other forms of hurdles that exist. For example, Serum Institute in India, which is one of the biggest manufacturers of vaccines in the world, has not been able to manufacture enough vaccine or the number of doses that they predicted, even though they have license from various vaccine innovators. And the main reason for that is some of the raw materials they need to build these vaccines come from United States. And United States has a ban on those raw materials to be exported anywhere outside of United States. So even if you take away the patents, but you still don't export the raw materials, you will not see any vaccines. So I believe that that debate is very misguided, and we should try and bring it back to where it should be. So those were the three things I wanted to talk about. Happy to answer any questions.
So, I have a question regarding the variants. You said that the variants will migrate slightly, but not too much. The question is, what is there a pattern, a specific pattern in the characteristic of the virus as it mutates? For example, does it are those mutations more about the transmissibility of it, or the mortality of it? Is there a pattern? That's the first question. The second question is, I'm assuming that all of these mutations are related to the spike that allows it to connect. That's it.
So thanks for your question, Adam. To answer your second question first, not all the mutations that we see are in the spike protein. Mutations are occurring in all different proteins of the virus. The ones that are occurring in the spike are more worrisome. And the main reason why they are more worrisome is because the immune response that we get from the vaccine is against the spike. So any mutation that occurs in that part of the virus, we want to look very much more carefully. To answer your first question is, where are these mutations occurring, and what are the characteristics of these mutations? A couple of things around that. So firstly, there are some parts of the virus genome that is mutating more frequently than other parts of the virus genome. And the way we know this is because certain types of mutations are being discovered again and again with no connection to previous lineage. So you find that one mutation that occurs in Brazil, and then you find it happening independently in South Africa. And then 6 months later, you find it happening independently in India. So those are not related directly from the same lineage. So there are reasons why some bits of viruses mutating more than others. But again, there is no method to this madness. The virus is not smart enough to know that it should mutate this part of its genome to be able to become more transmissible or more deadly. But what happens is that if it is more transmissible, that virus species becomes more dominant, because now that virus species is transmitting more. And until now, what we have seen is that most mutations that have occurred have been ones that increase transmissibility, which as a result of its increased transmissibility creates more cases. And because it has more cases, increases mortality as a function of that. Per se, we haven't seen a virus which is much more deadly than this virus per se. So that's one thing, because one of the reasons, so the areas where the virus gets an advantage from having a mutation, one is transmissibility, which could be due to how tightly it can bind to the receptor, which means you may need very small number of viruses to actually get inside you and all those viruses manage to bind and get internalized. So that is a much more efficient infective virus. And the second one could be that it sheds more virus particles. So once somebody has it, then they are spreading more. So each time they cough, they are throwing out 1 million viruses compared to 1,000 viruses of the other one. So as a result, that transmits more. So that's how transmissibility increase happens. The second way that viruses can become more transmissible is by increasing the length of period when a person is not asymptomatic and is still transmitting, because that escapes our behavior patterns. Because if we are not sick, we don't stay indoors, we don't use a mask, we don't get tested, and we keep transmitting the virus to more people.
I have a question for Glenn or Vishal. This is Rob.
You said you're at a Best Buy. Where is this Best Buy?
It's I'm actually in Virginia, Bill's second favorite state. The if you're in 3 buckets here, what does the experts, what are they telling us? If bucket 1 is you're vaccinated, bucket 2 is you've had COVID and then you're vaccinated, and bucket 3 is you've just had COVID and you have natural antibodies. What's going to be sort of the strongest defense on the variants that the data is telling us thus far?
I have not seen empirical data on this, but based on what studies I've seen, so the best kind of data to discern this would be to have epidemiological data where we follow people, we identify people getting infected, and then we go back and see what group they fell in out of the 3 buckets, right? I have not seen a large enough series of such data yet, but based on the biology of the virus, what I can give, this would be my guess, and I will let Glenn give his guess or his understanding of it. I believe that someone with 2 shots of a vaccine, or someone who has had COVID and has had a vaccine, is likely to be better protected than just just having an infection. And the reason for that is that there is a wide variation in different people who get COVID of the severity of the COVID they get, and also the strength of the immune response they're able to generate. On the other hand, the immune response generated by the vaccine is very much more controlled, and there is much less variation in that. So it is more predictable. Glenn, over to you.
Yeah, that's right. I was seeing if I could pull up a slide, but I didn't find it. Oh wait, is this the slide? Yes, so let me open up this and share. So there's been so Vishal, I agree with everything you just said. I'll just add this one slide. So in terms of the impact of the antibodies, when you compare, is this what I wanted to look at? So basically, when you compare the first dose versus the second dose, I'm not sure if this is telling me what I'm about to say, but basically people who were previously infected have sort of like a medium antibody response, whereas people who are vaccinated the first time have a smaller response than that. Once people who are previously infected get their first vaccine dose, they sort of get this like maximal antibody response. It's a high level of antibodies and immune response, not to Vishal's point, not just the antibodies, but the cellular immunity as well. Once you, people who have not been previously infected, once they get that second dose, they're roughly the same level as people who have not been, as people who have been previously infected, let me say, and have received the vaccine. So really the vaccination is going to be important. People who, that third bucket that you're talking about, people who have not gotten the vaccine but have been previously infected, it does not provide the same level of immune response. And so we definitely know this from a few different studies at this point. Just that the level of immune response is much higher after getting at least one vaccine dose after that natural infection.
And by the way, just to finish that off, thanks, Glenn, is that it is not unusual for vaccines to provide better immune response than natural infection in many, many conditions.
Thank you. That's very helpful.
Other questions that are out there, you can either put them into the chat or you can jump right in.
Can I just ask? I'll wait until someone's got a ready question.
I was just going to say one thing, because this is going to be an ongoing question in terms of what's going to happen in November. Every conversation that I hear about in terms of how well we're doing globally or in the countries that are starting to do well is looking at spread after vaccination. But the one missing variable that people aren't talking about is how much mask wearing is still going on, social distancing. A lot of people are still not back in the office. Those other interventions are having an additional protective effect in addition to the vaccine. And the worry is that come fall, a lot of us are not going to want to wear masks anymore if the spread is low, if the background spread is low and we've all been vaccinated, or most of us have been vaccinated. And as soon as we start to remove the vaccines, we go back to work and we reduce the social distancing and whatnot. We spend a lot more time indoors. It's not an apples to apples comparison, because at that point, really, the spread can dramatically increase versus even with the vaccines among the vaccinated people. And in that case, I'm not talking about necessarily transmission among those who are vaccinated, but among those who are unvaccinated, it's really a different type of situation that we need to be talking about at that point. And that's why I'm still a little bit skeptical going into fall, winter of next year, that it's really going to be over in the United States at that point. But it's still an open question.
I think, Glenn, I think that's a very, very, very good point. I think that the data so there is some data on transmission of vaccines reducing transmission, and it looks good, but we still don't have solid data there. And I think that having that solid data would give me a lot more comfort that if we are actually reducing transmission, then this becomes a social contract. Then we should be focusing much more on getting people vaccinated, because every vaccinated person then doesn't become a vector of disease. And I think that would be the game changer.
Do we have an understanding, looking earlier, Glenn, at the map that you had regarding the infections and spreading, do we have an understanding as to why Africa, why it's not as transmissible, why Africa is not as infected as the rest of the world? Is that an issue of collecting data? Is it an issue of travel?
So yeah, that was an interesting hypothesis. A lot of us were really worried back in March of last year, given the healthcare systems in Africa, that they would be hit really hard and it would be really problematic. And that hypothesis was proven wrong. That Africa turned out to be in much better shape than we were, probably for a variety of reasons. For instance, the age people who live there tend to be younger, which so puts them at lower risk, et cetera. I don't have a good answer for what's going on there now. I don't know if Michelle or Steve do, but personally, I mean, it could be things like variant changes might just have made it more contagious now, and so now we're seeing more spread than we did before. For me, I just am looking at this and it's concerning me a little bit. It makes me think we're not out of the woods yet in Africa when you look at those maps.
Yes, after what we saw in India, I think it's only a matter of time, unfortunately. I think there were a lot of hypotheses around why India had not been hit so hard, and they were related to exposure to other viruses, natural immunity, some kind of genetic predisposition to not getting the infection. But I think all of them turned out to be wrong, because you have to have a certain set of circumstances to occur. And once that occurs, you get that exponential growth. And those things happened in India in March and April, and we saw what happened. And I fear that such an inflection point could occur in Africa. And I hope it doesn't, but I don't see any logical reason now why it might not.
Yeah, there was one other hypothesis that was circulating around, probably more popular as opposed to in the scientific academic community, that there's a lot of anti-malarial drugs running around, in Africa, and that the thought was that was helpful in terms of preventing infection or mitigating symptoms if people were infected. And that's sort of the classic hydroxychloroquine argument on that. What do you guys think about that one?
I want to see some more data for that to see how prevalent really are these antimalarial drugs, because the effect is very profound if it is that. And we have not seen such profound effect even in clinical trial settings with large doses. So I would love to see, I hope it is true, but it would require, I would require a very high level of evidence to believe it.
Having lived in Africa, I would dispute that. Most Africans don't take antimalarial drugs. They get malaria and then they treat it, because you can't be on, well, hydroxychloroquine, first of all, is not useful in Africa. It's chloroquine resistant malaria there. So you'd have to take one of the more toxic drugs, which you can't take daily. So, at least in the 16 countries that I've spent time in, you use nets, you try not to get bitten. And if you get bitten, you look for symptoms and then you go to the clinic and get some drugs. Many of my African colleagues and friends had malaria multiple times because it's just the only option. So I doubt that is really what's causing it. There is some talk around some folks in Africa that their like MMR vaccine is composed differently than ours, but I don't think that ever amounted to anything.
And to Vishal's point, I think that these clinical trials have been conducted and they really have not demonstrated strong clinical efficacy. And so that's the bottom line, I think, in terms of their use here.
I just had a somewhat non sequitur, but you mentioned malaria, and one of our babies that's growing up is using synthetic bio to produce a molecule that cures malaria. It's been funded by the Gates Foundation. And it's now that it's being accelerated. Is there a role for synthetic bio if we're entering into a whole new era as a mitigant of what we're dealing with?
So I saw a synthetic biology company building a virus which would live inside us and generate antigens which are related to coronavirus and would continue to immunize us through exposure. So yes, I think that, so my belief is that we have seen the vaccines that we have seen so far are amazing, but they are probably the worst vaccines for coronavirus that we will see. And the reason I believe is because the future ones are going to be a lot better. I do not think we can immunize 7 billion people in the world with the vaccines we have. They're far too expensive. They're very hard to transport. They're very hard to give. So the companies that are out there that are building the nasal vaccines, which can be given in school to hundreds of kids in one afternoon, they're vaccines which come in form of patches. So you can apply a patch which releases the antigen into your skin. It may not be known to many people, but our skin is a very, very active has a very active immune component in form of dendritic cells. And those dendritic cells can take up these antigens and then train our immune system to look out for that antigen. So I think that so in my view, we will find those to be really, really important strategies for us to deal with this issue.
There was a question in the chat earlier, and Glenn, I think you touched on it in terms of how the behavior of this virus is going to look relative to the flu, and we've kind of had that ongoing conversation, circulating around. But maybe you guys could comment a little bit about that.
I can just talk briefly. This is a really interesting topic that I'd like to share. I have a couple of slides that I can look at this just real briefly. So a lot of people don't realize when you look at the history of these pandemics, and so this was a slide that I prepared in March of last year. This is comparing side-by-side order of magnitude. Spanish flu, or the flu of 1918, which a lot of us compare this to. a lot of people say, well, how did that end? And in reality, the flu that's still spreading today is their variants, they're descendants of the Spanish flu. There's actually a few different kinds of flu. So there's influenza A, influenza B, but basically everything that's in the shape H1N1 or H something N something comes from the influenza A virus, and all of those are descendants of the flu of 1918. So the flu of 1918 spread never actually ended. We never reached herd immunity with it. It's still spreading, and we still get infected every year. And so that means avian flu, swine flu, all these things, the H, X, and X are still descendants of this. So when we talk, but because of all the variants, a lot of years we don't have much to worry about, and some years it comes and becomes an epidemic and is different. COVID, the one other thing that I'll mention here is that, interestingly, with the flu of 1918, one of the reasons that the mortality was so high was we have to remember that that was before we had oxygen to even give people. So we had respiratory illnesses, and we didn't even have oxygen to help people with. And then the big debate at that time was whether influenza was even a virus or a bacteria. And at the time, a lot of people who were dying were actually dying of these bacterial infections that were just opportunistically taking advantage of the viral infection. And so if the flu of 1918 were to hit again today, it would be a far, far less severe epidemic than otherwise. So when we look at COVID-19 in that context, that so many people are getting sick and dying with oxygen for the most part, and with the top medical care that we have, until it's overwhelming the healthcare systems, unfortunately, in some of these places, COVID-19 is really bad relative to the flu when we talk about this. It's definitely a global pandemic that we really can't underestimate. And so in terms of that slide that I showed a little bit earlier, this is something I keep coming back to. I like these head-to-head trials of US, flu versus COVID. And the fact that so many more people are having really severe consequences 6 months after they recover from hospitalization with COVID versus flu, something is going on that's persistent. It could just simply be because it was a novel virus, and whereas people have previously been infected with flu in their lives, that's sort of contributing to this, whereas COVID was completely novel. But it's definitely a more serious disease, at least for the next few years for the population.
I can say that one of our findings at the IHME about the seasonality component and the similarities and differences are that COVID is not exactly following the same seasonality as the flu. It was more directly aligned with pneumonia. And we thought that was kind of an interesting finding based on all the data.
What are you thinking, Steve, in terms of what's going on in South America? How do your models compare with that based on the seasonality aspect of it?
So being in the Southern Hemisphere, it's not surprising that they're having so much trouble. And so it's just the reverse cycle is what we're having in the Northern Hemisphere, what we had in the Northern Hemisphere. So it's not surprising that it continues to get worse into the summer, and then that's when it peaks, and then things should get better.
Yeah. And I just want to put a plug in. Steve mentioned a little bit about sort of the total deaths on the IHME charts versus reported. And I think that's really interesting because there's been a lot of conversation about sort of collateral deaths related, to COVID. And Steve, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the new sort of darker lines on your charts reflect that, and they've been even-handed about it as well, because on one hand you have deaths related to people, psychological situations leading to suicide, other types of things, but then on the other hand, because of all the social interventions that we've had like a really low flu season this year, and so we've had less deaths with regard to just straight up flu, and that's also reflected in their numbers. So the new totals that are on there, a much more broader base look at the impact of COVID on society. So you guys are to be commended, for that. And I think it's a really interesting addition to the charts.
Thank you.
So let's see, we've got about 10 minutes before the appointed bottom of the hour. Other questions? If you think I'll tell you one thing that I wanted to ask about was sort of Sweden. Sweden's had a big jump, certainly on a per capita basis, and they've been sort of an interesting case study because of the way that they handled things earlier and sort of panic and stuff like that. I don't know if the guys want to comment about Sweden, because right now it's definitely one on a per capita basis that is rising.
I'll make an early comment and then I want to turn it over to my colleagues. But in the beginning, there was a huge debate, and the idea was with Sweden, they had a whole different perspective that perhaps they could get to herd immunity more quickly. They didn't want to kill the economy. And so they made a conscious trade-off that they wouldn't have the kind of restrictions and lockdowns that other countries had, but that it wouldn't make so much difference, or that they would accelerate through the process and economically they'd be in much better shape. And I think what time has shown is that that it did make a difference, that they didn't have many restrictions as their neighbors, and the economy didn't benefit as much as they had hoped. So that was just a background comment I wanted to make, but I'll turn it over to my colleagues.
Yeah, I think that's the story. That's it. If Sweden's doing poorly, it's spreading like crazy. There was no herd immunity, and so that's it. They made the wrong choice.
I agree. I think that the question that I had in my mind in the early part of the pandemic was, I was in favor of lockdowns. And the main reason I was in favor of lockdowns was not as a lockdown as an end to something, but I was very optimistic and hopeful that there will be a vaccine. And so the problem with Sweden now is that now we are looking back with 2020 hindsight, when we have 4 or 5 or maybe 7 really effective vaccines out there. And now we are looking at their behavior. It looks much worse than it did even a few months ago, because now the countries that had effective lockdowns and now have reopened well and immunized large part of their population, somehow that seemed to be, in hindsight, have been the best way of doing it.
Yeah. And I think, probably to that point, what's going on in India is just so absolutely tragic. And we've heard about that firsthand from, some of the 361 community people, who are based there. But, at the same time, the confluence of the elections as well as the religious holiday literally brought millions of people together. And, it's a very unfortunate consequence, where you have a virus that is as transmissible as COVID is. So, it's just been a very, very difficult outcome for them. But, but one can see how the seeds were planted, for that spike up,
yes,
that has happened there.
I think there were a number of unforced errors in the management of coronavirus in India. And one of them, Bill, that you did not mention, was that the urgency with which the vaccination program was started was did not match the scale of the problem at all. So my mother lives in India. I had been talking to her once in May, you must get the vaccine. She was one of the first people in her community to get it. And there weren't that many people queuing to get the vaccine. I was concerned that when the vaccine comes, there will be hordes of people and, people may not be able to get it. And she had to call up all her friends. So she became the vaccine sort of promoter in that area and tried to get more people get vaccinated, because there just hadn't been a government program to encourage people to get vaccinated. And I just think that is inexcusable.
As I understand, Vishal, India, as of 2-3 weeks ago had produced 250 million vaccines, but it exported over 200 million of them.
So I think that this may be factually true, but it often gets mischaracterized. So the way it worked for them was that there is a very large there is super scale vaccine manufacturing capacity in India, and that's because of historical reasons. And there have been many vaccine companies that have set up shop there to build these vaccines, which they build for mostly for WHO and sort of global procurement. And so when we were hit with this, a number of vaccine manufacturers went to Indian companies and said, will you manufacture these for us? And a part of that commitment was that they will not monopolize the manufacturing facilities just for India, but they will be part of COVAXin, which is a global effort to send vaccines to different parts of the world. So that was a commitment that was made under which the licenses were offered to them. And I can completely understand that when you have a nation in crisis and you have millions of doses sitting being airlifted in front of your eyes, it seems really bad. But I think that this could have been managed better if you believe the person who runs Serum Institute of India, which is the big manufacturing company. He claims that the Indian government did not place an order and did not give him the money to make more vaccine doses, which I think, again, just is it's bizarre.
Indeed. So, yeah, it's tragic. And, I think people have talked about, sort of the first world countries sort of monopolizing it, but at the same time, there is such urgency and for the United States and other countries to be able to funnel money, out to pre-buy all these vaccines. Think about where we were, last year at this time. I mean, it was really very much a dire situation, and the whole vaccine effort was just getting underway. So it's been remarkable in terms of what we as a country and we as a global community have been able to achieve in this time. And it's just a matter of making sure that it gets spread out to all those in need. We're just about at the end of our time, but certainly any last thoughts from our panelists?
And as part of that, we always ask what would the community like to see next, either this subject or ancillary subjects. We will have a health tech event coming up. We have a therapeutics event coming up.
So, well,
now, Bill, there's always the pregnant pause. You have to wait for it, and then someone comes up with a brilliant idea.
Mark, when you say health tech, do you mean medical device, or what do you mean?
Yeah, that's included. It could be digital health, could be various aspects.
Okay.
Like Vishal, the point Bill made a year ago was we were wiping down every single part of the groceries that were coming in. We've learned a lot. But what else how is this otherwise, transforming the health industry?
So I think that now I see many more companies tackling infectious diseases. Infectious diseases was not an area so most of the biotech industry has created value around cancer drugs, and infectious disease has never been an area of interest, and I've seen much more of that. I'm also seeing a lot of companies being formed in the area of surveillance, in terms of health surveillance of some type. In other words, tracking antibiotic resistant pathogens, tracking different things happening around the world. I have seen one major shift here in the UK, which I think is going to be a massive shot in the arm for the health tech industry for us, is that in general, we have a single payer health system called the National Health Service. And by and large, the CIOs of those hospitals were very reluctant to use cloud technology for data because they felt more secure to have servers localized in the hospitals. And during COVID, they had to overcome their reluctance to use cloud technology. And now they are rapidly expanding into the cloud, which means it is easier for other companies to work with them and to build other products. So I think that one thing has changed a lot of companies' futures here.
I just saw a question in the comments about is there a need for emergency preparedness software? So this is something I don't want to shock people, but it was an interesting thing. So after SARS-CoV-1, after SARS hit in the early 2000s, the world realized that we were not prepared for understanding what emerging viruses were out there. And so the United States, for instance, spent money putting epidemiologists on the ground in China, trying to get ahead of this, but also funded some other research programs where they actually went to bats and took saliva samples and blood samples in the wild. So capturing all these bats and trying to just see the diversity of viruses that they could find out there. And what they found were over 400 or roughly 400 different coronaviruses. 50 of them were similar to SARS-CoV-1 and SARS-CoV-2. So we could literally be having new epidemics where we have SARS-CoV-3 hit, SARS-CoV-4, SARS-CoV-25. And so I think what it really demonstrates is that we need to have better emergency preparedness in general for epidemics for this kind of thing. And it's not just that SARS-CoV-2 is the end of it. And then when we get this under control, that's it.
Yeah, I think that people often underestimate the scale of viruses that we encounter every day. So every year, millions of viruses skip species from one species to the other, and we are constantly being bombarded by so 80% humans is composed of genetic material that has been introduced to us through viruses.
Michelle, you froze up. We lost about the last 30 seconds.
Oh, sorry. What I was saying was that there are estimates that about 9% of our genome is derived from viruses. So over generations, we have all these viral infections, and this viral DNA material has merged into our DNA material for this long. So we are constantly surrounded by viruses. So it is not a surprise or a shock that this happened. It's a surprise or a shock that it didn't happen sooner.
So in the remaining time, do you, or Glenn, have your own theory about the origin of COVID? Was it animal to human transmission, or was it a lab accident, or what was it?
I have virtually full confidence that it was animal to human. The whole idea of lab generation. If someone were to create on purpose, if they were an evil genius and they wanted to create an epidemic, this wouldn't have been the way to do it, because you would have probably wanted to start with a human virus and then just change that, as opposed to starting with a random bat virus and trying to adjust that. The number of mutations necessary to make it a global epidemic couldn't easily be predicted. We still don't know how to predict it, and it just seems kind of silly. What are your guys' thoughts?
I think that to have made it in the lab for this purpose seems extremely unlikely, because you would have to do some human trials to find out if it is going to do what you want it to do.
Or could it have been not made in the lab, but could it have been studied in the lab?
Yes, I think that is completely possible. And, you know, it is possible that the variant of this was in a lab. But I don't think that so the question really is that what are the two options? If the option is that so in my mind, the option is it went from an animal to a human. If it went in the lab along the way, I don't think that changes the main focus. Now, the thing which is different from this one is that somebody designed this virus for the purposes of causing a pandemic, which is the option 2. And I think both Glenn and I are not in favor of option 2. We are in the option 1.
Yeah. Good. Well said.
Yeah, I'll be on the counterpoint only to bring up the growing popularity of the Nicholas Wade article
Yes.
on Medium, and I'll put that in the chat. It is interesting, and Vishal, it kind of goes to your point in the sense that there are and have been some very sensitive experimentation, going on in the Wuhan lab, and it's very possible that something kind of got out of hand there. That's how it goes up. But I'll give it back to you.
I can speak with some dubious authority on that matter, because my lab was once closed down because we were experimenting with a virus that we should not have been experimenting with, and one of the professors in my department got fired. So yes, it is in theory possible to do that, but the level of experimentation that is required to make it directed in that way. So the Nicholas Wade article focuses on the furin cleavage, saying that it is very unlikely to have occurred in nature. And I think that that premise is not true. So I think that is what, so the way this argument is becoming, it is almost a religious argument now, because both sides are unfalsifiable. I cannot give anybody any evidence which is incontrovertible that it came from an animal and never went into a lab. And equally, unless somebody has video footage of someone making that virus and then releasing it, they can't prove their side. So this is going to be a religious debate, and this is never going to be solved.
I might be able to add a couple more points of evidence, though, that might give our argument more, make it more compelling, Vishal. So the two things that I'm referencing. So this first research project that the U.S. government did after SARS-CoV-1, looking at the bats, one of the things that they did is they went and did antibody tests, looking at the antibodies to coronavirus among the population in China that lived near the bats. And what they found were that millions of people were exposed to these diversity of coronaviruses every year. So this idea of millions of people being exposed to the diversity of coronaviruses versus a single person or two people being exposed to a lab experiment that went wrong, millions is a lot of time to roll those dice. The other thing is that one thing that we found about SARS-CoV-2 over the last year is that quite a large proportion of the spread is due to super spreader events. If you just look at individuals who are infected, it's actually not very likely that an individual is going to transmit the virus to other people. It's the average of the super spreader events and the ones who don't spread it that are giving it the R0 that was so high. So the likelihood of an individual or 5, 10 people in a lab being infected and then spreading it to other people is actually somewhat small, because it's the super spreader events that are really driving it. So it's another form of skepticism for me that really drives that.
But I think if humans can do something to create more pandemics, is what they're already doing. So we are doing things which lead to such pandemics happening. So in that sense, there is a human hand behind this, which is around our farming methods, about different species living close to each other, blood being mixed, slaughterhouses that are not properly regulated. So we are doing things, and so the human hand is there. Whether it is a conspiratorial human hand of 5 people designing this idea with a nation state behind them, or whether it is all of us eating meat the way we do and buying cheap food, there is a human hand.
Yeah, it's Vishal, you froze up on us again, but we got the human hand point, and it's so true. I guess also I have to get my chip shot in. I guess the 40,000 potluck dinner in Wuhan that was right afterwards, could have, they're hypothesizing maybe that could have done it. But yeah, so there's a lot we certainly won't know. I think the thing is that it's still with us, and we'll have to continue to work hard as we have been to bring things back to a normal that we kind of recognize.
Well, let me ask the panelists, Bill, when do you think that would be an apropos time to put something on the calendar to do this again?
I will repeat what our Prime Minister said, data, not dates.
Okay. We'll leave it open. Well, actually, I thought that sort of the pick of this time was very appropriate and unusually coincidental given everything that's been going on. So we'll keep an eye on that.
Let's hope that the schedule is such that things calm down and really do follow the base case until the fall. And then it'll be a big open question whether they stay low or whether there's another wave come the late fall, early winter.
What's the over-under that I see you, Vishal, in London in November?
I think I will bet for that to happen. Yes, I think that's likely.
And how many other countries could I visit in November? My goal is to go around the world to
I think around the world, I'm not betting in favor of because the vaccine distribution is still very challenging.
You'll be rolling a little bit of the dice there, Mark, I think.
Or maybe just that Bob Geldof, that's that London, New York axis then.
Yeah.
You can stay on a boat.
Life is dangerous, Mark. You have to live it.
I know I looked at that map. You're going deep into that dark red. Congratulations on that IPO though.
No, very good.
Well, thank you again. And Glenn and Vishal and Stephen for sharing your time and educating us.
Yeah, so grateful for you guys. We really appreciate it. For number 5, your troopers, and just the level of conversation you bring to the table is so much appreciated. So thank you so much, and thanks to everyone for showing up this morning. So
Thanks for having me.
And on that note, have a good rest of the week.
Tuesday.
Thanks, everybody.
Tuesday's briefing focuses on inflation. Tuesday, 11 o'clock. Come join us. Part of what you were talking about, Stephen.
All right.
Talk later.
Bye-bye.
Take
Thanks,
care.
everyone.